our good friend Rex Bastfield has provided a second set of questions to me about Scientology.
Did you adopt a negative view of non-Scientologists while in?
Yeah, I'm going to explain here that the word that Rex originally used was wog, and non-Scientologists, some Scientologists call them wogs. I never accepted that term, and I remember the first time it was used. Very soon after I got in, a few weeks after I got in, moved into an apartment with a Scientologist, and he wasn't there very often. Didn't see much of him. He later wrote an affidavit attacking me, but that can happen if you involve yourself with a new religious movement that isn't very nice. But I asked him, look, is there anything you don't like? Meaning, I'm living in the apartment with you. Would it be okay if I burn joss sticks or whatever? Is there anything you don't like? I personally don't like the smell of liver cooking, so I don't like people to do that in my house. Sorry. So if you come around here,
no liver. Don't
try and cook any liver. So it was a general question. I was quite surprised when he said, "Oh, just wogs." The thing he didn't like was wogs. Now, for me, that was a term of racist abuse, as it is in Britain. Hubbard picked it up here and thought it was funny. It's pretty much the same as the N-word in the US. It's a nasty thing to say. And I immediately said, well, two of my good friends are Indians, these brothers that I went to school with. And he said, no, it means non-Scientologists. And it seemed to me just a weird position to be in. I don't like non-Scientologists. It's like, that's not very good, is it, really? For myself, no, I never developed any aversion to non-Scientologists. Hubbard also called them raw meat, because they had no spirituality, and dead in the head. So the attitude of contempt of the superior elite that we find in negative cult groups was right there. Raw meat, dead in the head, wogs.
Yeah, there we go. Right. Did you find the principle of the ARC triangle interesting and of use in life?
Right. ARC triangle. Well, Rex, we're into territory here. The affinity, reality, and communication form understanding. ARC in Scientology. Never said ARC, always said ARC. So it's not an acronym, it's an initialization. Let's get technical here. If we said ARC, it would be an acronym. And it would be arc welding or something like that, probably. It's nonsense. Affinity is the desire to be close to something, Hubbard said, and so he used that term instead of the word love, which is fair enough, but he just kind of gives it a sciencey chemistry, the affinity of chemicals. Reality is that which is real, the physical world, and communication is an interchange of objects or ideas. And his idea was that you make a little triangle, and if you increase any corner of the triangle, you'll increase all the others. So, as I have often pointed out, if you communicate by screaming and yelling at somebody, which is increasing the amount of communication, you won't raise their affinity unless they've got something wrong with them. Hubbard also said bullets too are a form of communication. So shooting somebody won't actually. It might make them feel more real. Dead, and it might make them understand you better, but their affinity for you, so it's pseudoscience, and I can't really think of an application for it. And the problem is with pseudoscience that once you believe a principle that's not in fact true, that's not based upon evidence, then you will draw wrong conclusions in life. So the idea of Scientology was to increase the affinity, reality, communication, understanding. In fact, it was even said in one of the secret documents that anybody who had done operating Thetan level 3, in the advanced courses, would have an incredibly high affinity. Well, my experience of Scientologists was not that at all. When they harass you for 16 years, you get that their affinity level is very particular to their own group. It is not for humanity. It is for themselves, and that's narcissism, not affinity.
How did you deal with some of the crazier pseudoscience stuff you read, like reading about the wavelength of affinity, for example?
Rex is scientifically trained and understands these kind of things better than I do. I was not scientifically trained, and so a lot of it just went over my head. It didn't really have any meaning to me, frankly.
Did you accept it?
Kind of, but as it didn't matter whether I accepted it either. It was not something that I would repeat. It's not something I'd try and persuade other people of. You know, and I later looked at the book All About Radiation, where he claims that he is written by a nuclear physicist and a doctor. The doctor is called Medicus and is later, I think Farley Spink was his name. But how much he had to do with writing the book, I don't know. The book is a Hubbard book. The nuclear physicist is Ron Hubbard, who, of course, had, dropped out of, actually was thrown out of university for deficiencies in scholarship, having failed a course in atomic and molecular physics. He never took a course in nuclear physics, which is quite different to atomic and molecular physics. There were no such courses at that time because the Copenhagen interpretation, I think, was published in 1928 by Niels Bohr, Heisenberg and Schrödinger. And that is the beginning, really, of nuclear physics. There was the investigation of quanta within the atom by Max Planck around about 1900. And the quantum leap is first mentioned then, that energy seems to be able to move without crossing the distance it moves across. There are freaky things there. But there was no nuclear physics, so Hubbard was basically lying. And in that book, he talks about gamma rays and their ability to do things. And I later found out that what he says there is not, in fact, scientifically adequate, which I think is true of much of what he said.
Okay. Did you experiment with Dianetics before you started going to the mission?
No. I think, Rex was more of the experimenter than I. I was an absolute standard techie. I met many people who weren't. And that was, I did exactly what it said in the book. And if I didn't understand what it said in the book, I kept going until I developed an idea of it. So I didn't do anything outside of the organisation. Everything I did per policy, following the bulletin, doing what Ron said. And if it didn't work, I blamed myself, which is quite usual in authoritarian groups. If any benefit you got because of the cult's doctrine, the group's doctrine, anything that went wrong, it's because you didn't do it properly. You'll find that doctors do the same with medicines. You take the medicine that's meant to cure you and it doesn't work. They get hypochondrophobia, as Patrick Wall, the great pain specialist, calls it. So I think there's a general human trend there to, it says here in the book that this works, you bleed you with leeches and you'll be cured, and you're not being cured, you're being bad, and that's stupid. So I didn't experiment with Dianetics or any other Scientology technique outside of the courses I did. Rex, on the other hand, went and got the books and tried things out. He was probably far more sensible than I was. He still got himself into a bit of a mess over it, but
were you ever tempted to try auditing outside the organisation's reach?
No. In fact, after we left, my friend Mitch asked me to audit him. And I said, I don't think it works. And he said, well, try it anyway, because he felt that there was some process somewhere in this of recollecting things, of doing little exercises that would be helpful. I came to realise that, and I certainly did meet people who felt they had benefited tremendously. I remember somebody who was suicidal who said that they overcome it through auditing. But I didn't see anything that you couldn't actually fix in a more direct way. And I became alarmed at the amount of guided imagination that was going on. So, for example, there's a code for auditors. It's called the Auditor's Code. And one of the statements in it is never evaluate for the pre-clear, for the person who is receiving the auditing. And yet, the pre-clear would have read this 400-page book on Dianetics about all these engrams and things that they've got going on, you would always be evaluated for and told what was going on. It would never be a situation where you just sit somebody down cold and do this and see if it worked. I never heard of that happening. I'm sure it did occasionally happen, but I never met anybody, and I've met over 1,000 people who've been involved, who'd actually done it without it having explained to them what was going to happen first. Now, expectation conditions experience. If you think you're going to find these periods of unconsciousness and pain where people are saying things, you'll find them. You know, whether they exist or not, well, seems highly unlikely, as memory is not recorded during periods of unconsciousness, and we're pretty confident about that from the physiological evidence. The simplest way of testing it is to ask a boxer about the few seconds before they were knocked out, and they won't remember them because the process of memory fixation does not happen.
At first, and maybe later on, did you feel uneasy about all the pictures of LRH in missions and orbs?
Right, LRH, L. Ron Hubbard,
Yep.
Missions and orgs, the missions and the organisations of Scientology. No, I didn't. He was the guy that had these ideas. His picture was on the wall. It was only later that I realised that this was kind of ritualising the guru. These were like pictures of Jesus or Buddha or something, and it was a bit much. And it was very interesting during the late 1980s, while I was still engaged in studying Scientology and its practices, that pictures of David Miscavige became more frequent in the magazines than pictures of Ron Hubbard. I wonder why.
No. Did you think that some people saw him as some sort of deity or person to be worshipped?
Very much so, yes. And it was never my attitude. You know, my friend Mitch, who I've mentioned a number of times, he and I had a very irreverent attitude. He used to call him L. Ron Sideboard. And I think it's Hubbard Cupboard Sideboard. You know,
Oh, okay.
one of those.
No. Yeah.
And we, even when we were told off for that, we just kept on doing it. Because the sense was that he was human and it was quite important not to regard him that way. But I met many people who, you know, they believed he'd, you know, spent millions of years acquiring this, that he really was Meteya, the Buddha who would save all of mankind, as he claimed. And by the way, the Hymn of Asia, the book where he says, "Am I Meteya?" in this long and winding poem, originally the handwritten version that was given to John Sanborn, the director of publications, in 1954, said, "I am,"
Yeah,
which is why for more than 20 years Sanborn wouldn't publish it, because he thought it was arrogant.
A little bit.
He knew Hubbard. And he realised he could go, if he went, "Am I Meteya?" that might bring it down a notch. But yeah, there are people who believe he's the greatest man who ever lived. There are people who believe he had supernatural abilities, though he never demonstrated them in any way and didn't really talk about anything. He didn't even claim to have done any magic. So yeah, he wanted to be viewed as a god, I'm quite sure, and many people do view him that way. I never did. And I don't now. And I'm not going to. So
Not ever?
No.
Okay.